So first, we need to know what we're talking about when we're talking about the hip. In the Liberated Body workshop, we talked about the hip is just the space between your femur and your pelvis. So what does this look like when we're flexing the hip if we're talking about the movements of the femur and the pelvis? To show you, we're going to use this lovely prop, the duct tape, as your pelvis, and my pen is going to be the femur. So let's say where my hand is here, this is the back, this is like your tailbone, your coccyx, and this is the femur hanging out in the hip socket. So there are, what we're going to explore today, 5 ways we can actually flex the hip. And we want to be able to do all of these 5 ways. So the first one, if we're just looking at what is a hip flexion, let's pay attention to this angle here. This is the front of the hip. This is the tailbone, remember? So a flexion of the hip would be closing this angle. This is a neutral hip. We could take the femur and bring it up like this. And that would be called flexing the hip by moving the femur on the pelvis. So we'll call this a femur on pelvis hip flexion. Now we can also take the pelvis and roll it forwards along down the femur. And that will also close that angle at the front of the hip. So this is our pelvis on femur hip flexion. We can do both of those at the same time. We can bring the femur and the pelvis together to close that angle at the front. And if my hand here at the back is the tailbone, the coccyx, you can see how that's lifting up as we have this is our like anterior tilt with the pelvis, as we have the femur moving up towards it. That's the most extreme hip flexion we can get. Now, what happens if you take the pelvis and you actually do a posterior tilt? So now you're opening up the hip, stretching out the hip flexors. So, but you can still get a hip flexion by doing this motion. All you have to do now is take the femur with it a little further. So I'm doing a posterior tilt of the pelvis, and I'm taking the femur up into flexion further, which is closing the hip. So even though the pelvis is posteriorly tilted, which should actually stretch the hip open, if the femur comes with it further, then you're going to be able to flex the hip. And that happens at a particular moment in the gait cycle. We'll explore that today. The last way we can find our hip flexion is if the femur, rather the pelvis, shifts backwards, taking the femur along with it, dragging it like that. So that would be, I'll just get out of the way so you can have a blank wall. That would be more like a hip hinge. So think deadlift, as you shift the pelvis backwards and the hip, rather the femur, just tilts back with it a little bit. And that doesn't really happen when we walk so much, but it does happen when we do things like deadlifts and squats and work out at the gym. So those are our 5 ways of flexing the hip. The next thing we need to look at is what muscles are we interested in when the hip flexes. We can think about this in terms of muscles lengthening and loading to manage hip flexion. And we can think about it in terms of what muscles would contract and squeeze, concentrically contract to create a hip flexion. And so we know that in this study of gait, Gary Ward's Anatomy and Motion we've been doing, we're most interested in what muscles are lengthening and loading, like that elastic band, to manage the hip flexion. So what muscles do you think should eccentrically load to slow down this action of the hip flexing? It's going to be the muscles at the back of the pelvis. Namely, it's going to be hamstrings, a little bit the glutes, and a little bit the adductors. One adductor in particular, there's many, there's 6, if I'm correct. But there's one that will contribute to slowing down hip flexion. And so for the purposes of today's exploration, we're going to try to find the sensation of those muscles loading as we bring our hips into flexion, instead of feeling the muscles at the front of the hips contracting and squeezing. So if at any point during one of the movements we're exploring, you're feeling more of that squeezing, gripping, contracting feeling at the front of your hips, This is a concentric muscle action, so bringing the muscle together, squeezing it, shortening it. That's not really what we're after for today's exploration. There are exercises you can do at the gym that the goal is to squeeze the hip flexors if you're working on building the muscle up. But we're more interested in how can we more effectively, more efficiently manage the movement of hip flexion where it shows up in our lives when we walk, so we can move with the most ease.